Imagine the person you trust most announcing the sale of your father's life's work at the very moment you're celebrating it. He laughed at the old dust, not knowing he'd just signed his own financial death warrant. I was down, but I wasn't out. Let me tell you how it all began. The morning air in Northern California always carries a hint of salt and cedar. But today, the scent of the heritage oak felt different. It felt like victory. For 3 long years, I had lived on black coffee and sawdust, pouring every cent of my savings and every ounce of my soul into restoring my father's workshop. This wasn't just a business. It was a sanctuary built on the calloused hands and the work hard, stay honest philosophy that defined my father's generation. As I stood on the makeshift stage, looking at the faces of our community, people who remembered my dad's craftsmanship, my heart was full. I tapped the microphone, my voice trembling slightly with a mix of exhaustion and pride. I talked about the American dream, about how a pile of raw timber could become a family's legacy if you treated it with enough respect. I thanked the neighbors for their patience and the local craftsmen for their loyalty. And then, I looked at Liam, my husband of 10 years, the man who had sat across from me at the kitchen table every night as I pored over blueprints and tax debts. He was smiling. It was a sharp, brilliant smile that I mistook for pride. I thought he was my rock. I thought he was the one person who understood why I had sacrificed new clothes, vacations, and even a decent night's sleep to keep these doors open. I leaned into the mic, ready to invite everyone inside for the first tour. But before I could utter a word, Liam's hand was on my shoulder. It wasn't a supportive squeeze. It was a calculated move. He smoothly plucked the microphone from my hand, his movements as polished as the expensive Italian suit he was wearing, a suit I had paid for. "Thank you, Ava. That was charmingly sentimental," Liam said, his voice booming through the speakers with a practiced, predatory charisma. He didn't look at me. He looked over my head, addressing the crowd like a politician at a rally. But let's be honest. We live in the 21st century, not the 1950s. While my wife has been playing carpenter in this drafty old shack, I've been looking at the bigger picture. The heritage oak is a lovely sentiment, but it's an economic anchor. It's a relic. And frankly, it's a waste of prime real estate. A cold shiver crawled up my spine. The crowd went silent, the festive atmosphere evaporating like mist in the California sun. I reached for the mic, my voice a frantic whisper, asking him what he was doing, but he stepped away, blocking me with his body. "I am thrilled to announce," he continued, his eyes gleaming with a cruel sort of triumph, "that as of 9 o'clock this morning, the sale of this property has been finalized. The heritage oak is being decommissioned to make way for the Sterling Heights, a luxury penthouse complex. We're trading this pile of rotting wood for real progress, and for a lifestyle that doesn't involve splinters and sweat." The world tilted. I felt the blood drain from my face, leaving me lightheaded and cold. My father's workshop? Sold? "Liam, you can't," I gasped, finally finding my voice, though it sounded thin and broken. "I own this place. I didn't sign anything." Liam turned to me then, and the look in his eyes was one I'd never seen before, or perhaps I had just chosen to ignore it. It was pure, unadulterated contempt. He leaned in close, his breath smelling of expensive bourbon and mint. "Oh, Ava, you really should read the fine print when you're too tired to function," he sneered, his voice low enough only for me to hear. "That financial support agreement you signed last month when you were coming down with the flu? That was a power of attorney and a bill of sale. You handed me the keys, darling. You were so desperate for a hero that you didn't notice I was the repo man." He laughed, a short, sharp sound that felt like a slap. He then turned back to the crowd and gestured toward a woman standing in the front row. She was wearing a cream-colored power suit and holding a designer briefcase. She looked like she had never stepped foot on a dirt path in her life. "I'd like to introduce Vanessa Thorne, the lead representative for the Apex Development Group. She's helped me realize that some things are better off demolished than restored. Vanessa stepped up onto the stage, offering a tight, plastic smile that didn't reach her eyes. She shook Liam's hand, her movements lingering just a second too long, her gaze shifting to him with a proprietary intimacy that made my stomach churn. It wasn't just a business deal. The way she tucked a stray hair behind her ear while looking at my husband, no, that man, told me everything I needed to know. The late-night consultations, the sudden investor meetings in Los Angeles, the new password on his phone. It all clicked into place with a sickening thud. They weren't just selling my father's legacy. They were building their new life on its ashes. Liam looked at me one last time, his lip curling in a smirk of utter arrogance. "Don't look so tragic, Ava. You always said you wanted this place to be a landmark. Well, now it'll be a landmark for people who actually matter. Why don't you go find a broom and start cleaning? You've got 48 hours to vacate before the bulldozers arrive. I'd hate for you to get dust on that vintage apron of yours." I stood there, paralyzed, as the man I loved and the woman he was sleeping with began to toast their success with champagne that had been intended for our celebration. The neighbors were whispering, some looking at me with pity, others with the awkwardness of people witnessing a public execution. I could feel the heat of humiliation rising in my cheeks, the weight of my father's dream collapsing around me. My hands, stained with the wood finish I had applied just hours ago, were shaking. Liam thought he had broken me. He thought he had taken everything: my money, my home, my father's memory. He looked at me as if I were a piece of scrap wood, something to be discarded and forgotten. But as the first tear escaped and hit the dusty floorboards, a spark of something else flickered in my chest. It wasn't sadness. It was a cold, hard realization. He thought he was the hunter, but he had no idea that the foundation he was standing on was much deeper than he could ever imagine. I felt like the floor was disappearing under my feet. If you've ever felt a betrayal that took your breath away, please hit the like button and tell me where you're listening from. I need to know I'm not alone in this storm. The silence that followed the roar of the crowd was worse than the betrayal itself. Within an hour, the champagne flutes were empty. The investors had retreated to their air-conditioned SUVs, and the heavy oak doors of the workshop had swung shut, leaving me alone in the dim, amber light of the late afternoon. I stood there, my boots rooted in a thin layer of fresh sawdust, staring at the empty stage where my husband had just dismantled my life. The air still smelled of Liam's expensive cologne, a sharp synthetic scent that felt like an intrusion against the deep, earthy honesty of the wood. I walked slowly toward the back of the shop, my hand trailing along the edge of the massive workbench my father had built 40 years ago. My fingers found the deep notches carved into the side, marks he'd made to measure the growth of his business and, eventually, the growth of his only daughter. I closed my eyes, and suddenly, the coldness of the present was replaced by the warmth of 1995. I could almost hear the rhythmic shh, shh of his handplane and the low, steady hum of the radio playing classic country. My father, Elias, was a man of few words but infinite patience. He belonged to a generation that didn't believe in pivoting or disrupting markets. He believed in the grain of the wood, the strength of a dovetail joint, and the sanctity of a handshake. I remembered standing on a milk crate just to reach the tabletop, watching his calloused, grease-stained hands guide a piece of raw timber through the saw. To anyone else, it was just lumber. To him, it was a kitchen table where a family would pray, a cradle for a newborn, or a desk where a young girl would dream of becoming just like her daddy. "Ava, honey," he'd say, his voice like sandpaper and honey. "You never rush the wood. If you force it, it'll splinter. You listen to what it wants to be." He taught me that the most important tool in this shop wasn't the lathe or the drill press. It was my own integrity. In our corner of California, where the tech boom was starting to turn orchards into office parks, my father stayed stubborn. He paid for everything in cash, saved every copper penny in an old Maxwell House coffee tin, and never once took a shortcut. He'd tell me about how his own father had survived the Great Depression by fixing what was broken instead of throwing it away. That was the American dream he passed down to me. the dignity of a day's work, and the pride of leaving something behind that would outlast your own name. I opened my eyes and looked at those same walls now marked with Liam's foreclosure stickers. It felt like a desecration. Liam saw this place as rotting wood and wasted real estate. But he didn't understand that every beam in this ceiling was held up by my father's sweat and my mother's prayers. When the 2008 crash hit and other shops were folding, my father worked 16-hour days to make sure not a single one of his men lost their pension. He didn't have a brand identity, but he had a reputation that was worth more than gold in this valley. I remembered the day he handed me the keys, his hands shaking not from age, but from the weight of the responsibility he was placing in mine. Keep the heritage alive, Ava. Don't let the world turn you into something that can be bought and sold. I sank onto a pile of cedar planks, the scent of the wood rising up to meet me like a familiar embrace. It's funny how we remember the things we sacrificed. I remembered the college spring breaks I spent sanding chairs while my friends were in Cabo. I remembered the wedding gift money from my grandmother that I immediately used to repair the roof of this very building. I never felt like I was missing out because I was building something real. Liam hadn't just stolen a piece of property. He had stolen a lifetime of doing the right thing. He'd looked at the tattered blueprints on my desk, the ones I'd stayed up until 2 a.m. perfecting, and called them sentimental garbage. The sunlight was fading now, casting long, skeletal shadows across the floor. I looked at my hands. They were rough, a few small scars marking the years of labor. They were working hands, exactly like my father's. And then I looked at the spot on the floor where Liam had stood in his $1,000 shoes, mocking the very foundation he used to climb higher. He thought he was smart because he knew how to move numbers on a screen, but he didn't know the first thing about what makes a structure stand. He didn't understand that a tree with deep roots doesn't just fall over because someone saws at the trunk. I realized then that my father hadn't just left me a workshop. He had left me a spine made of iron, and a heart that knew the value of a dollar earned rather than stolen. The old dust Liam laughed at was actually the ashes of a man who was 10 times the human being Liam would ever be. I stood up, wiping the grime from my face, the grief in my chest hardening into something cold and sharp. Liam might have the paperwork, and he might have the woman in the cream suit, but he didn't have the soul of this place. He had no idea that you can't build sterling heights on a foundation of lies. Not while I was still breathing. I looked at the Maxwell House tin, still sitting on the high shelf where my father had kept it. It was empty now, but the lessons inside it were still mine. My father always said that when the storm comes, you don't run. You hunker down and check your joints. Well, the storm was here. And as I looked at the dark silhouette of the old oak tree outside the window, I knew that this wasn't the end of the story. It was just the end of my silence. The scent of cedar always brought me back to my father, but as the moon rose over the silent workshop, another memory began to push its way through the grief. A memory that tasted like cold tea and betrayal. I looked down at my hands, the same hands that had signed away my life 6 months ago. It was November, and a rare, freezing rain was lashing against the windows of our home in Santa Clara. I remember that night with a clarity that burns. I was drowning. A massive order for a boutique vineyard in Napa was behind schedule. The lumber prices had spiked, and I was shivering with a fever that turned the world into a blurred, spinning mess. I had been living on 3 hours of sleep and pure stubbornness, trying to prove that I could carry the weight of the heritage oak alone. And that was when Liam walked into the kitchen, looking every bit the savior I so desperately wanted him to be. He hadn't been wearing a $1,000 suit that night. He was wearing his comforting husband sweater, the soft cashmere one I'd bought him for his birthday. He placed a steaming mug of herbal tea next to my laptop and began to rub my shoulders, his touch light and practiced. "Ava, honey, he whispered, his voice dripping with a concern that I now realize was as manufactured as a Hollywood set. You're going to break. Look at you. You're shaking. My father used to say that a captain who refuses to delegate is just a captain who wants to go down with the ship. Is that what you want? For your dad's dream to sink because you're too proud to accept a little help? I remember leaning back into him, letting out a breath I felt I'd been holding for years. I was so vulnerable, so tired of being the only one holding up the sky. He pulled a stack of papers from his leather briefcase, the one Vanessa had probably picked out for him. He called it a creative financial reorganization grant. He told me he'd pulled some strings with his connections in the city to get me a low-interest line of credit that would cover the workshop's overhead for a decade. It's just a formality, babe, he said, flipping to the signature pages he'd already marked with neat little yellow "Sign Here" tabs. It basically just gives me the authority to handle the bank calls and the boring tax stuff so you can get back to the wood. You're an artist, Ava. You shouldn't be stifled by spreadsheets. I remember laughing weakly, touched that he cared so much about my artistic soul. I didn't even reach for my glasses. My eyes were burning from the flu, and the room was swaying. I trusted the man who had promised to love and honor me. I trusted the person I shared a bed with. As I sat in the dark workshop now, the memory of that pen hitting the paper felt like a physical wound. The ink had looked so dark, so permanent. Liam had watched me sign every single page, his eyes tracking the movement of my hand with a predatory stillness. He didn't offer to read the clauses to me. He didn't mention the transfer of title buried on page 42 or the irrevocable power of attorney hidden in the appendix. He just kept whispering how proud he was of me for letting go of the stress. When the last signature was done, he didn't kiss me with passion. He kissed my forehead with a chilling kind of finality. He had what he wanted. The financial support he promised was nothing more than a noose he had spent months weaving, waiting for the exact moment I was too weak to fight back. The most bitter part of the memory wasn't the deception itself, but the performance that followed. For the next 5 months, Liam played the part of the supportive partner to perfection. He'd bring home expensive takeout, ask me how the sanding was going, and talk about our future as if we were actually going to have one. Meanwhile, he was meeting Vanessa Thorne in dimly lit bars in San Francisco, handing over my father's land surveys and deed history. He was planning the demolition of my soul, while I was thanking God for a husband who understood my passion. I had been so frugal, saving every scrap of mahogany, repurposing old nails, and skipping dinners to pay the shop's insurance. And all that time, Liam was spending our joint savings on a down payment for a penthouse I wasn't invited to live in. I looked around the shop, the shadows stretching like skeletal fingers over the machines. I realized then that Liam hadn't just stolen the property. He had weaponized my love against me. He had used my exhaustion as a doorway and my trust as a key. He didn't see a legacy here. He saw a relic that could be liquidated for a faster car and a younger, sleeker life. He had underestimated the woman he married, though. He thought that because I was quiet and hardworking, I was simple. He thought that because I valued tradition, I was stuck in the past. But sitting here in the dark, surrounded by the ghosts of my father's tools, I realized that the fine print went both ways. Liam was so focused on the sale that he forgot to check the foundation. He forgot that in this family, we don't just build furniture. We build things that are meant to last, and we always, always keep a record of the debt. The silence of our home in Santa Clara felt like a heavy shroud as I stepped through the front door. For years, this house had been a place of shared dreams, or so I thought. But as I walked through the darkened hallway, the air felt thin, tainted by the lingering scent of Liam's arrogance. He wasn't home, of course. He was likely at some high-end bar in Santana Row, clinking glasses with Vanessa Thorne, celebrating the liquidation of my father's life. My grief had reached a turning point, the paralyzing weight in my chest was slowly being replaced by a cold, crystalline focus. I didn't turn on the lights. I didn't need to. I knew every corner of this house, every floorboard that creaked, the house I had paid the mortgage on for the last 5 years while Liam found himself in the world of high-stakes real estate. I headed straight for his home office, a room I usually respected as his private sanctuary. How foolish I had been, honoring his privacy while he was dismantling my heritage. My father always told me that if you want to find the rot in a piece of timber, you have to look beneath the bark. I started with the mahogany desk, another piece I'd crafted for him as an anniversary gift. My hands, still smelling faintly of the workshop cedar, felt like an insult against the sleek, polished surface. I wasn't looking for a confession letter. I was looking for the paper trail. Liam was many things, cruel, greedy, and vain, but he was also meticulously organized when it came to his own comfort. It didn't take long. In the bottom drawer, hidden behind a stack of old tax returns, I found a leather-bound folio. Inside were the receipts of my own destruction. I sat on the floor, the blue light of my phone illuminating the evidence of a betrayal so calculated it made my skin crawl. There were wire transfer records from the Heritage Oak operating account. The very account he told me was empty, to a private holding company called L&V Acquisitions. L&V, Liam and Vanessa. The financial support he'd supposedly secured for the workshop was actually a series of high-interest loans taken out in my name, which he had immediately funneled into this shell company. He hadn't been saving the business. He had been harvesting it like a dying crop. Then I found the brochures. Glossy, heavy stock paper featuring the Sterling Heights penthouse. There were floor plans with messy handwritten notes in the margins, Liam's handwriting. Ava's shop proceeds cover the closing costs, one note read. Vanessa likes the marble in the master bath. I felt a hysterical laugh bubble up in my throat. He was using the money from my father's rotting wood to buy marble for his mistress. He was trading 40 years of my father's sweat for a rain shower head and a view of the city skyline. The sheer, unadulterated gall of it was breathtaking. He didn't just want to leave me. He wanted to strip mine my life on his way out. But the real crown jewel was tucked in the back of the folio. A series of printed emails between Liam and a legal firm specializing in asset protection. The dates began nearly a year ago. This wasn't a sudden lapse in judgment or a midlife crisis. This was a long-game heist. He had been planning to wait until the workshop was at its most vulnerable, right after the expensive renovations I'd poured my heart into, to trigger the sale clause. He'd even timed my flu in November. One email to Vanessa stood out, dated the night I signed those papers. The little bird finally signed. She was so tired she didn't even blink. The oak is ours. See you at the hotel for the real celebration. I stared at the screen until the words blurred into a jagged mess of ink. I thought of the nights I'd spent frugal to a fault, skipping my own medical checkups to ensure the shop's apprentices got their holiday bonuses. I thought of the winter I wore 2 coats indoors because I didn't want to spend the shop's reserve on heating. Every cent I had saved was just another dollar for his penthouse. Every sacrifice I had made was just making the L&V lifestyle more comfortable. The betrayal wasn't just the affair. It was the theft of my labor, my time, and my father's dignity. I didn't cry. The time for tears had ended in the sawdust of the workshop. Instead, I pulled out my phone and began taking high-resolution photos of every single page. Click, the wire transfer. Click, the penthouse brochure. Click, the email calling me a little bird. Each flash of the camera felt like a small, sharp victory. I wasn't the grieving wife anymore. I was a hunter, and I had just found the trail. Liam thought he had outsmarted a sentimental carpenter, but he had forgotten that a carpenter knows how to measure twice. He thought he had the upper hand because he had the paperwork, but he had left the most dangerous weapon of all right under his bed: the truth. As I tucked the leather folio back exactly where I'd found it, I felt a strange, cold peace wash over me. I walked to the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water, my hand perfectly steady. I looked at the wedding photo on the mantle, the one where I was looking at him with such utter, blind devotion. I didn't break it. I didn't throw it. I simply turned it face down. Liam wanted a performance? Fine. I would give him the performance of a lifetime. I would be the broken, defeated wife he expected to see. I would play the part of the little bird with a broken wing until the very moment I was ready to sharpen my talons. He thought he was the one holding the leash, but he had no idea that I was already building a cage of my own. And the best part? He was going to pay for every single bar of it. The engine cut out in the driveway with a familiar, heavy thud, the sound of a vehicle that had seen a decade of honest miles. It wasn't the high-pitched, self-important whine of Liam's new sports car. It was Margaret's Buick. I stood in the kitchen, my heart hammering against my ribs, the digital ghosts of Liam's betrayals still burning behind my eyelids. I expected a confrontation. I expected her to walk through that door draped in the suffocating mantle of motherly loyalty, ready to explain away her son's mistakes, or to tell me that a marriage is a cross you must carry until your shoulders break. That was the script, wasn't it? The mother protects the son, no matter how much of a monster he's become. I gripped the edge of the granite countertop, a countertop Liam had insisted on, even though the old wood one was perfectly fine, and waited for the storm to break. When the knock came, it wasn't the frantic pounding of someone looking for a fight. It was 3 slow, deliberate raps, the sound of someone who had already made up their mind. I opened the door, my face set in the cold, distant mask I had practiced in the office mirror. Margaret stood there, framed by the porch light, looking every bit the woman who had survived 30 years in the California school system and 20 years of widowhood. She wasn't wearing the designer labels Liam tried to force on her for public appearances. She was in her garden fleece and sensible loafers, her silver hair pulled back in a tight, no-nonsense bun. In her arms, she held something wrapped in a faded kitchen towel. Something heavy. I didn't move to let her in. If you're here to tell me he didn't mean it, Margaret, or that I should prey on it, you can turn around right now, I said, my voice as sharp as a chisel. I've seen the papers. I've seen the penthouse brochures. I know exactly who your son is. Margaret didn't flinch. She didn't look offended or defensive. Instead, she looked at me with a profound, weary sadness that bypassed my anger and struck something deeper. I know who he is too, Ava, she said, her voice steady and low. And I suspect I've known longer than you have. A mother hopes she's planted an oak, but sometimes, no matter how much you water the soil, all you get is a weed with a silver tongue. She stepped forward, not waiting for an invitation this time, and walked past me into the kitchen. She set the heavy, towel-wrapped object on the table, with a metallic clink that echoed in the silent room. She didn't look at the face-down wedding photo. She didn't look at the luxury appliances. She looked at me, her blue eyes, the same shade as Liam's, but filled with a light he had never possessed, searching my face. I was at the gala today, Ava. I stood in the back. I heard what he said about your father's rotting wood. I saw the way he looked at that woman in the cream suit. She took a deep breath, her shoulders sagging for just a fraction of a second, before she straightened them with that ironclad resolve of her generation. I didn't raise a thief, Ava. And I didn't spend 40 years saving every scrap of my teacher's pension and clipping coupons until my fingers were stained with ink, just to watch my son burn down another man's legacy for a view of a city he doesn't even belong in. He thinks he's a king because he's learned how to move numbers on a screen, but he's forgotten that the ground beneath him was paid for with the sweat of people who actually knew how to build things. She reached out and slowly unwrapped the kitchen towel. Beneath it sat an old, battered iron box. It was covered in scratches and a fine patina of rust, the kind of box a man might keep under his floorboards or at the back of a workshop. It looked completely out of place in our modern kitchen, and yet it was the most beautiful thing I had seen all day. "What is this?" I whispered, the coldness in my chest beginning to thaw into a confused, painful hope. Margaret placed her hand on the lid, her fingers tracing the old-fashioned latch. "This is what happens when a mother realizes her son has lost his way," she said softly. "Liam thinks he owns the heritage oak. He thinks he outsmarted you with those fancy lawyers and those late-night signatures. But Liam always had a habit of overlooking the things he thought were beneath him. He overlooked me. He thought I was just a retired old woman living on a fixed income, someone he could manage, and eventually move into a nice, quiet facility when I became inconvenient." She looked at me, a grim, knowing smile touching her lips. "He forgot that I was the one who handled the books for his father's business for 30 years. He forgot that I know how to read the fine print just as well as he does, and I know where the bodies are buried." I watched as she pulled a small, tarnished key from her pocket. The air in the kitchen seemed to grow still, the weight of the moment pressing down on us. This was the turning point. I had the evidence of his affair and his theft, but Margaret had something else. She had the history, she had the lineage, and more importantly, she had the moral authority of a woman who chose justice over her own blood. "I watched him buy those suits with your money, Ava," she continued, her voice gaining a hard, rhythmic edge. "I watched him treat you like a servant in your own father's house. And every time he did, I made a phone call. Every time he invested your savings into his shadow companies, I took notes." She slid the key into the lock. "He thinks he's the hunter, darling, but he's about to find out that the most dangerous person in the world is a mother who is ashamed of her son." The lock turned with a satisfying, heavy click. Margaret didn't open it yet. She looked me in the eye, her expression one of absolute, unwavering solidarity. "Liam wants to play the game of high-stakes real estate? Fine. Let's show him how we used to play in the old days. Before we begin, I need to know one thing, Ava. Are you ready to stop being the wife he thinks he can break and start being the woman your father raised you to be? Because once we open this box, there is no going back. He will lose everything, and he will deserve it." I looked at the iron box, then back at Margaret. For the first time since Liam took the microphone at the gala, I felt like I could breathe. I reached out and placed my hand over hers on the lid. "Open it," I said. The lid of the iron box creaked open with a groan that sounded like a long-held secret finally being exhaled. I expected to see gold or jewelry, something tangible and gleaming, but what lay inside was far more valuable in the world Liam had dragged me into. It was packed tight with manila folders, bank statements, and yellowed legal documents held together by rusted paper clips. The scent that wafted out wasn't the synthetic floral perfume of Vanessa Thorne. It was the smell of old ink, basement air, and the quiet, persistent determination of a woman who had spent decades counting every penny. Margaret reached in and pulled out a stack of promissory notes, her hands moving with the precision of a master librarian. "You see these, Ava?" she whispered, her voice hardening with a cold, intellectual fire. "These are the high-interest lines of credit Liam told you he secured from his investors. He told you they were the workshop's lifeline. In reality, they were the anchors he intended to use to sink you. He expected a faceless corporation to foreclose on this property the moment you missed a payment, allowing his shell company, L&V Acquisitions, to swoop in and buy the land for pennies on the dollar." I leaned in, my eyes scanning the fine print of the top document. My breath hitched. The creditor wasn't a bank. It wasn't even Apex Development. The name listed as the primary lien holder was something called the Blue Oak Trust. I looked at Margaret, a question forming in my mind, but she was already one step ahead of me. "That's me, Ava. My maiden name was Blue. For the last 2 years, every time Liam negotiated a new debt for the workshop, I was the one on the other side of the table. He thought he was being clever, using a middleman to hide the source of the funds, thinking he was borrowing from some shadowy private equity group. He was so blinded by his own arrogance, so convinced that his old-fashioned mother didn't know how to navigate the digital world, that he never bothered to trace the wire transfers back to their origin. He didn't realize that the money he was using to save the shop was actually my retirement fund, my husband's life insurance, and 30 years of frugality. Every dollar I ever saved by sewing my own clothes and driving that old Buick until the floorboards rusted. The sheer brilliance of it made my head spin. Liam had been trying to steal the workshop by burying it in debt, but he had accidentally sold that debt to the one person in the world who would never call it in, until now. Margaret flipped through the pages, revealing a meticulously kept ledger. He's been skimming off the top for months, Ava. He's been taking consultation fees from the shop's account to pay for that penthouse. But here's the mistake he made. He signed a personal guarantee on those loans. He was so sure the Apex deal would go through and wipe the slate clean that he put his own name on the dotted line. He didn't just sell your father's land. He tied his own financial throat to the same rope. She pulled out a final, crisp document, a deed of trust. And this is the most important piece. When your father was sick, before he passed, he asked me to keep an eye on things. He knew Liam had a restless spirit. He gave me a right of first refusal on any sale of the property, tucked into a private agreement that Liam never knew existed because he never bothered to read the old filing cabinets in the basement. He thought they were just trash and dust. I felt a surge of intellectual satisfaction that was almost better than revenge. Liam had treated me like I was a simpleton, a little bird who couldn't understand the complexities of the modern world. But here was Margaret, a woman of the silent generation, who had outplayed him at his own game using the very values he mocked: patience, frugality, and attention to detail. "So he doesn't own it clean?" I asked, my voice gaining a new, sharp edge. Margaret shook her head, a grim smile playing on her lips. "Not even close. To the outside world, he's the owner. But on paper, he owes the Blue Oak Trust, me, $3 million, payable in full upon any change of ownership or decommissioning of the site. If he sells to Apex, he has to pay me first. And once he pays the taxes, the penalties for his fraudulent wire transfers, and the interest he's accrued, he won't have enough left to buy a studio apartment, let alone a penthouse." She handed me a thick folder labeled "The Receipts." It was a blow-by-blow account of every time Liam had lied, every time he had moved money illegally, and every time he had met with Vanessa Thorne to plot the destruction of the Heritage Oak. "He thinks he's playing checkers, Ava, but we're playing chess. He's already made his move. He's announced the sale. He's publicly humiliated you. He thinks he's won." Margaret leaned back, the iron box sitting between us like a silent judge. "But here is the catch. We aren't going to stop the sale. Not yet. We're going to let him think he's successful. We're going to let him sign that final contract with Apex at the penthouse. We're going to let him pop the champagne and toast to his own brilliance." She looked at me, her eyes narrowing with a predatory sharpness that I had never seen in her before. "Because the higher he climbs, the more it's going to hurt when we pull the ladder out from under him. But to do that, you have to do the hardest thing of all. You have to go back to him. You have to be the broken, grieving wife. You have to wear that vintage apron he laughed at and look like you've lost everything. Can you do that, Ava? Can you wear the mask until I give you the signal to take his head?" I looked at the documents, then at the photo of my father on the wall. The grief was still there, but it was no longer a weight. It was fuel. I thought about the way Liam had looked at me on that stage, the way he had dismissed 40 years of history as old wood. I thought about the little bird he thought he had trapped. I reached out and took the folder from Margaret, my grip firm and sure. "I won't just wear the mask, Margaret," I said, my voice cold and steady. "I'll give him the performance of a lifetime. He wants to see a woman who has lost her way? I'll show him exactly what he expects to see. I'll be so broken that he'll forget I ever knew how to swing a hammer. And while he's looking at my tears, I'll be measuring the height of his fall." I stepped back into our sleek, glass-walled house in Santa Clara, and for the first time, I didn't see a home. I saw a stage. The air conditioning hummed with a cold, sterile precision that felt like a mockery of the warm, sawdust-scented air of the workshop I had just left. Liam was in the living room, sprawled on the Italian leather sofa that cost more than my first industrial table saw. He was swirling a glass of amber liquid, probably a 20-year-old scotch bought with the workshop's emergency repair fund, and staring at a digital rendering of the Sterling Heights on his tablet. He didn't even look up when I entered. He just let out a long, theatrical sigh, the sound of a man burdened by his own genius. I stood in the doorway, clutching my jacket around me, making sure my shoulders slumped and my eyes looked red-rimmed from the tears I had spent the drive over perfecting. I had to be the broken woman he expected. I had to be the little bird with the clipped wings. "I thought you'd be packing," Liam said, his voice smooth and devoid of any warmth. He finally looked at me, his gaze sweeping over my work boots and my dust-stained jeans with a flicker of genuine distaste. "The developers want the site cleared by Monday, Ava. I've already contacted a liquidation company to haul away the heritage equipment. It's mostly scrap metal at this point, but they might give us a few $100s for the sentimental value." I felt a white-hot spark of rage ignite in my gut, but I smothered it instantly. I forced my lip to tremble. I let a single, well-timed tear track through the smudge of grime on my cheek. "Liam, please," I whispered, my voice cracking just enough to feed his ego. "That's my father's life. You can't just scrap it. Isn't there any other way? We could talk to the bank again." He laughed then, a sharp, barking sound that echoed off the high ceilings. He stood up and walked toward me, the smell of expensive peat and arrogance preceding him. He reached out and patted my cheek, a gesture so condescending it made my skin crawl. "Sweetheart, your father was a great man for his time, but his time is over. You're holding on to a ghost. I'm trying to give us a future. Now be a good girl and sign the final divorce and asset waiver. I've had my lawyers draw them up to be generous. You'll get to keep this house for another month while you find a smaller place, somewhere more suited to your artisan lifestyle." I looked at the documents he tossed onto the kitchen island. They were thick, intimidating, and filled with the kind of legal jargon designed to make a person feel small. I knew, thanks to Margaret's iron box, that these papers were a trap. If I signed them now, I would be waiving my right to contest the sale of the workshop based on the fraudulent support agreement he'd tricked me into signing months ago. He watched me, his eyes narrowed, waiting for the pushback he expected. But I didn't push. Instead, I sank into a chair, buried my face in my hands, and let out a jagged sob. "I'm just so tired, Liam," I choked out. "Everything is happening so fast. I don't understand the numbers. I don't understand why you're doing this to me." I could practically feel his guard dropping. To a man like Liam, a woman's tears are a sign of total surrender. He didn't see the woman who had spent the last 2 hours memorizing wire transfer codes. He saw a nuisance he had successfully managed. He leaned over the counter, his voice dropping to that soothing register he used when he was about to lie. "I know it's hard, Ava, but trust me, once the penthouse deal is signed on Friday, we'll both be free. Why don't you take a few days? Go to a spa, get away from the dust. I'll handle the heavy lifting." The heavy lifting. The irony was so thick I could have carved it with a chisel. While he thought I was getting away from the dust, I spent the next 48 hours in a clandestine war room. Margaret had arranged a meeting with a high-stakes litigation attorney, a woman named Sarah who had built a career on dismantling men exactly like Liam. We met in the back of a quiet diner in Campbell, far from the prying eyes of the Silicon Valley elite. I showed her the photos of the leather folio, the penthouse brochures, and the blue oak trust documents Margaret had provided. Sarah's eyes lit up with a predatory gleam that matched my own. "He's been incredibly sloppy, Ava," she whispered, flipping through the records of the consultation fees Liam had been skimming. "He was so sure you'd never look that he didn't even bother to wash the money properly. He's commingled marital assets with his shell company, and he's committed blatant wire fraud. But the masterpiece? That's Margaret's lien. By announcing the sale to Apex before clearing that debt, he's triggered a default clause that's going to make his head spin." Every time I went home, I put the mask back on. I played the part of the doting, defeated wife to perfection. I even made him dinner, his favorite, a prime rib roast that I'd meticulously prepared while secretly recording his phone calls from the next room. I heard him talking to Vanessa, laughing about how easy I was to manipulate. "She's actually apologized for being a burden," he told her, his voice dripping with mockery. "She's so busy crying over her daddy's saws that she hasn't even noticed the moving trucks I've scheduled for her personal belongings. See you at the signing, babe. The champagne is already on ice." I stood over the stove, a sharp knife in my hand, listening to my husband plan my homelessness with the woman he was cheating with. A year ago, this would have broken me. Now, it was just another measurement, another notch on the wood. I was counting down the hours until Friday. I was waiting for the moment when the little bird would show him that she knew exactly how to dismantle a house of cards. Liam thought he won, but he had no idea his own mother was the one holding the leash. Do you think Margaret was right to side with her daughter-in-law over her only son? Like this video and comment the word justice if you want to see a man like Liam pay for his greed. The floor-to-ceiling glass of the Sterling Heights penthouse offered a panoramic view of the Silicon Valley lights, shimmering like a carpet of spilled diamonds. But to me, it felt like standing in a high-tech aquarium, cold, transparent, and utterly soulless. The air was thick with the scent of expensive lilies and the sharp, yeasty tang of vintage Krug champagne. Liam was leaning against a marble kitchen island that probably cost more than my father's first 3 years of profit, his arm draped possessively around Vanessa Thorne's waist. She was wearing a silk dress the color of champagne, looking every bit the queen of the new empire they had built on the wreckage of my life. When the elevator doors slid open and I stepped out, Liam didn't even have the decency to look guilty. He just checked his Rolex, a smirk playing on his lips as he took a slow, theatrical sip of his drink. "Right on time, Ava," he called out, his voice echoing off the minimalist concrete walls. "I was worried you'd be too busy mourning that old pile of sawdust to witness the birth of something actually valuable. Come in, don't be shy. The notary is in the study, and Vanessa was just telling me how much she's looking forward to seeing the bulldozers break ground on Monday. It's a new era, darling. Try to keep up." I walked across the polished stone floor, each click of my heels sounding like a heartbeat in the cavernous space. I wasn't wearing my work boots today. I was wearing a tailored charcoal suit, the kind of power outfit Liam always told me I didn't have the personality to pull off. Beside me, Margaret walked with a quiet, lethal grace, her expression as unreadable as a closed ledger. Vanessa's eyes flickered with a brief moment of confusion when she saw my mother-in-law, her grip tightening on her champagne flute. "Margaret, I didn't realize you'd be joining us for the closing," Vanessa said, her voice a practiced, corporate trill that barely concealed her irritation. Liam just laughed, shaking his head with a patronizing fondness. "Oh, you know Mom. She's probably here to make sure I'm putting enough away for my retirement. She still thinks we're living in the days of passbook savings and Social Security." He turned to me, his eyes gleaming with a cruel, triumphant light. "Did you bring the keys to the shop, Ava? Or did you accidentally lose them in a fit of sentimentality? Because honestly, we don't need them. The demolition crew is authorized to use bolt cutters. It's more symbolic that way, don't you think? Cutting ties with the past." The arrogance was so thick I could almost taste it. He was so convinced of his own brilliance, so intoxicated by the view from the top of his house of cards, that he hadn't even noticed the change in the air. I looked at the heavy leather folio sitting on the center table, the final purchase agreement between L&V Acquisitions and the Apex Development Group. This was the moment he had been working toward for a year, the moment he would officially trade my father's legacy for a life of luxury with a woman who didn't know the difference between oak and pine. I felt Margaret's hand settle briefly on my arm, a steady, grounding presence. You seem very sure of yourself, Liam, Margaret said, her voice remarkably calm. It's a long way down from the 42nd floor. I hope you've checked the structural integrity of your investments. Liam rolled his eyes, a flicker of genuine annoyance crossing his face. Mom, please. This isn't a classroom, and I'm not 10 years old. I've secured $300 million in development capital. Vanessa and I are about to become the biggest names in luxury residential real estate in the Bay Area. While Ava was sanding table legs for $500 a pop, I was building a legacy that actually has commas in it. He walked over to the table, picked up a gold-plated pen, and gestured for me to join him. Last chance to sign the asset waiver gracefully, Ava. Do this, and I'll make sure the moving company doesn't accidentally drop your father's old blueprints into the bay. It's a clean break. You go back to your little artisan world, and I stay up here where I belong. What do you say? Shall we finish this? I didn't answer right away. I let the silence stretch, watching the way Vanessa preened, her hand tracing the diamond necklace that had likely been bought with the Heritage Oak's payroll tax reserves. I looked at the contract, then I looked Liam straight in the eye. The mask of the little bird didn't just fall off. I shredded it. I felt a cold, sharp smile spread across my face, a smile that finally made Liam's smirk falter. You're right about one thing, Liam, I said, my voice steady and crystalline. It is a new era, but it's not yours. I didn't reach for the pen. Instead, I reached into my bag and pulled out a single, neatly folded document. The one Sarah, the attorney, had prepared using the evidence from Margaret's iron box. I placed it on top of the Apex contract, right over the signature line. Before you sign that, you might want to check with your primary creditor, I said softly. Vanessa leaned in, her brow furrowed as she read the header. The Blue Oak Trust? Liam, what is this? Liam snatched the paper, his face turning a mottled shade of red as he scanned the lines. This is a joke. Some kind of pathetic stalling tactic. I don't know any Blue Oak Trust. My funding is private. Margaret stepped forward then, her presence suddenly filling the room with a weight that seemed to dim the city lights behind her. The funding was private, Liam, she said, her voice ringing out like a judge's gavel. It was mine. And as of 5 minutes ago, the Blue Oak Trust has issued a formal notice of default on every single support loan you took out in Ava's name. You've breached the terms of the lien by attempting to sell the collateral without prior written consent. Which means, as the primary lien holder, I'm not here to witness a closing. I'm here to seize the assets. The champagne flute in Liam's hand shattered against the marble floor, the sound sharp and final. The king of Silicon Valley suddenly looked very small against the backdrop of his glass palace. The air in the penthouse, once so full of celebration, turned icy and still. I watched the color drain from Vanessa's face as she realized that the empire she was marrying into was actually a mountain of debt held by a woman she had dismissed as a relic. Liam looked from the paper to his mother, his mouth working but no sound coming out. He thought he was the hunter, but he had just realized he was standing in the middle of a trap that had been set before he even knew the game had started. The silence that followed the shattering of the champagne glass was deafening, a vacuum that sucked the air right out of the room. Liam stood frozen, his eyes darting between the document in his hand and his mother's face as if he were trying to solve a puzzle that had suddenly changed shape. Vanessa's corporate mask didn't just slip, it disintegrated. She looked at the gold-plated pen on the table as if it had turned into a venomous snake. This is impossible, Liam finally choked out, his voice cracking, losing that smooth, practiced baritone he used for his investor pitches. Mom, you're retired. You're a school teacher. You don't have $3 million. You don't have a trust. This has to be some kind of pathetic prank Ava cooked up to stall the demolition. He tried to muster a laugh, but it came out as a hollow, desperate wheeze. Margaret didn't even blink. She stood with the ramrod-straight posture of a woman who had spent 40 years commanding a classroom and a century of family tradition. I am a woman who lived through the Great Recession, while your father and I built a life from nothing, Liam, she said, her voice dropping into a register of cold, disappointed authority. While you were busy spending your consultation fees on Italian suits and taking this woman to five-star resorts in Maui, I was doing what I've always done. I was being frugal. I was being frugal. I was investing in the only thing that ever mattered to this family, our integrity. I didn't need a high-rise office to track your greed. I just needed my kitchen table and a calculator. Every time you moved money from Ava's operating account to your shell company, I saw the digital footprint. Every time you forged a signature on a financial support document, I was the one who bought that debt from the middlemen you were so sure would protect you. You thought you were playing the market, but you were playing with your mother's legacy. And I don't lose. Vanessa stepped forward, her voice trembling with a mix of fury and panic. Wait, if the lien is in default, what happens to the Apex contract? We have a closing scheduled for tonight. The wire transfers are already pending. I stepped into her line of sight, feeling a surge of power that had nothing to do with the height of the penthouse and everything to do with the truth. The Apex contract is dead on arrival, Vanessa, I said, my voice cutting through the air like a fresh sharpened blade. You see, Liam was so busy looking at the zoning laws and the square footage that he forgot to check the original deed of the heritage oak. My father, Elias, might have been a sentimental carpenter, as Liam called him, but he was a man who understood how to protect what he built. He inserted a family heritage clause when he transferred the shop to me. It states that any sale to a third party is automatically void if the primary lien holder is a direct family member who objects to the decommissioning of the site. I leaned in closer, watching the sweat bead on Liam's forehead. Margaret doesn't just object. She's calling the loan. Right now. The realization hit Liam like a physical blow. He staggered back against the marble island, the very symbol of the wealth he thought he had stolen. But the penthouse. The down payment was $300,000 non-refundable, he stammered, his eyes wide with the realization of his own ruin. The Apex advance. I already spent it to clear my personal margins. Margaret looked at him with a pity that was more devastating than any scream. Then I suggest you find a very good bankruptcy lawyer, Liam, she said quietly. Because when the bank realizes you used fraudulent wire transfers to secure this penthouse, and when the authorities see the evidence of the shell company I've spent 2 years documenting, you won't just be homeless. You'll be a ward of the state. You traded a diamond for a piece of glass, and now the glass is breaking. Vanessa's head snapped toward Liam, her eyes narrowing with a terrifying, predatory selfishness. You said the title was clean. You said your wife was a nobody who wouldn't fight back, she hissed, her power suit suddenly looking like a cheap costume. She didn't offer a word of comfort. She didn't stand by him. She immediately reached for her designer briefcase, her only concern being how fast she could distance herself from the sinking ship that was Liam's life. This deal is a liability, she snapped, looking at me with a venomous glare before turning toward the elevator. Don't bother calling my office, Liam. As far as Apex is concerned, you're a fraud. And as far as I'm concerned, you're a mistake I'm done making. I watched her go, the silence of the room returning, but this time it was a clean silence. Liam was left standing in the middle of his empty glass palace, surrounded by shattered champagne and the wreckage of his own arrogance. He looked at me, his eyes searching for that little bird he could manipulate, for the wife who would forgive anything. But that woman was gone. She had been replaced by the woman my father raised, a woman who knew that you can't build a future on a foundation of lies. Ava, please, he whispered, his voice cracking. We can fix this. I did it for us. I did it so we wouldn't have to struggle anymore. I didn't even give him the satisfaction of a response. I simply turned to Margaret and nodded. The heavy lifting was done. The heritage was safe. And for the first time in 10 years, the weight on my shoulders was gone. The elevator doors hissed shut, taking Vanessa Thorne and her empty promises of a new era with them. The silence that rushed back into the penthouse wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, like the air before a terminal collapse. Liam stood in the center of the vast, open-plan living room, looking less like a titan of real estate and more like a ghost haunted by his own reflection in the floor-to-ceiling glass. He looked down at the gold-plated pen still clutched in his hand, then at the shattered remains of the vintage Krug staining the white marble. The man who had mocked my father's rotting wood was now standing in a palace made of smoke and mirrors, and the wind was starting to blow. He looked at me, then at Margaret, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. "You can't do this," he whispered, the arrogance replaced by a shrill, vibrating desperation. "The down payment for this place. I took it from the Apex advance. If the deal is void, they'll call for an immediate refund. I don't have it, Mom. I put the rest into those offshore accounts Vanessa suggested. If you call that lien, I'm not just broke. I'm a criminal." Margaret didn't offer a hand to catch him as he began to fall. She simply crossed her arms, looking at him with the clinical detachment of a bank auditor. "You were a criminal the moment you forged Ava's signature, Liam," she said, her voice devoid of any maternal softness. "You were a criminal when you treated your wife's inheritance like a personal piggy bank for your mistress. And as for your offshore accounts, my lawyer and Ava's team have already flagged those for the forensic accountants. You thought you were so clever, moving money through digital labyrinths, but you forgot that every labyrinth has a trail. You didn't just fail as a businessman, Liam. You failed as a man. You thought you were evolving past our values of frugality and hard work, but all you did was become a hollow shell. You're a paper king, and your kingdom just burned down." She turned her back on him, walking toward the window to look out at the valley, leaving him to face me. I walked toward the kitchen island, picking up the heavy leather folio he had been so proud of. I felt a strange sense of calm. The humiliation he had heaped on me at the gala, the way he laughed at my father's dust, the months of gaslighting, it all felt small now. He was a man who knew the price of everything and the value of nothing. "You told me I was a little bird who didn't understand the big picture," I said, my voice quiet but carrying the weight of the mountains. "You said I was an anchor, but you forgot that an anchor is what keeps a ship from being smashed against the rocks during a storm. You cut me loose, Liam. You cut the anchor thinking you'd fly, but you didn't have wings. You just had debt." I flipped through the brochures for the Sterling Heights, the glossy images of the lifestyle he had traded my soul for. "I'm going back to the workshop tomorrow. I'm going to start the machines, and I'm going to clean up the mess you made. And as for you, you have 48 hours to vacate this penthouse before the bank moves in. I'd suggest you save your Italian suits. You're going to need something to sell when the legal fees start piling up." Liam lunged toward me, a flash of his old temper flaring up, but he stopped when he saw the look in my eyes. It wasn't fear. It was nothing. I felt absolutely nothing for the man I had once thought was my rock. "Ava, please, I'll give it all back. We can tell the bank it was a misunderstanding. I'll work in the shop. I'll do anything." He was groveling now, his knees hitting the cold marble. The sight was pathetic. This was the man who had stood on a stage and called my father's life work a shack. I looked at his hands, soft, manicured, and trembling. They had never held a hammer. They had never known the honest sting of a splinter. They were hands that only knew how to take. "The Heritage Oak doesn't hire frauds, Liam," I said, turning to walk toward the elevator. "And it certainly doesn't hire men who don't know the difference between building a legacy and stealing one. You wanted progress? Well, here it is. The world is moving on without you." As I stood by the elevator, the chime echoing through the cavernous room, I looked back one last time. Liam was sitting on the floor, surrounded by the shadows of the luxury he had never truly earned. He looked small. He looked like the relic he had accused my father of being. The Sterling Heights wasn't a landmark. It was his tomb. I stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the ground floor. As the doors began to close, I heard him call my name one last time, a hollow, broken sound that was lost in the hum of the machinery. I didn't look back. I was already thinking about the scent of cedar, the sound of the saws, and the long, beautiful road back home to the only place that ever truly mattered. He thought he had broken me, but he had only stripped away the dead wood. What was left was the heartwood, strong, resilient, and ready to be shaped into something new. The sun rose over the Sonoma Hills, burning through the morning mist and casting a golden glow on the weathered sign of the heritage oak. I stood at the threshold of the workshop, the heavy iron key, my father's key, cool and solid in my hand. The foreclosure stickers had been scraped away, leaving only the faint, honest texture of the wood beneath. For the first time in years, the air didn't feel heavy with the suffocating weight of debt or the sharp, cold scent of Liam's deception. Instead, it smelled of possibility, of damp earth, and that deep, intoxicating perfume of fresh cedar and aged oak. I stepped inside, and the grit of the sawdust beneath my boots felt like the most stable ground I had ever walked on. I wasn't alone. Near the back, by the large windows that looked out toward the ancient valley oaks, Margaret was already busy. She wasn't wearing her litigation charcoal suit or the garden fleece she'd worn on that fateful night in my kitchen. She had on an old denim apron, her silver hair catching the light as she meticulously wiped down the blades of the industrial planer. She looked up and smiled, a quiet, radiant expression of shared victory. "The electricity is back on, Ava," she said, her voice steady and clear. "The bank sent the confirmation letter an hour ago. The liens are cleared, the titles are restored, and the Sterling Heights is officially a bad memory for the local zoning board." She walked over to me, her hand resting on the smooth surface of the workbench. "You know, your father and my husband used to say that the strongest part of the tree isn't the bark that everyone sees, it's the heartwood. It's the part that's been through the fires and the droughts, getting denser and tougher with every passing season. I look at you today, and I see the finest heartwood this family has ever produced." We didn't talk much about Liam. We didn't need to. The news from the city was enough. The penthouse had been repossessed, the Apex Group was suing him for fraud, and Vanessa Thorne had vanished into the next investment opportunity before the ink on his bankruptcy filing was even dry. He had wanted a life of luxury built on shortcuts and shadows, and in the end, the shadows were all he had left. My mother-in-law had done more than just save a business. She had protected the very idea that doing things the right way, the frugality way of saving, sacrifice, and integrity, still meant something in a world that often forgets its roots. She had chosen justice over the hollow loyalty of blood, and in doing so, she had become the mother I always needed. I walked to the main power switch, my fingers trembling slightly as I gripped the heavy lever. This shop was more than a collection of saws and lathes. It was a testament to the American dream, the real one. Not the one Liam chased in high-rise elevators, but the one built by hand, piece by piece, year after year. It was the dream that said if you treat your tools with respect and your customers with honesty, you leave behind something that matters. I thought about the thousands of families who had my father's tables in their homes, the children who had been rocked in his cradles, and the students who would now come to this shop to learn the trade from me. The legacy wasn't the property value. It was the craftsmanship of a life well lived. With a deep breath, I pulled the lever. The old motors groaned to life, a low, rhythmic hum that vibrated through the floorboards and up into my very bones. The sound was like a heartbeat returning to a body that had been still for far too long. Margaret and I stood there for a long moment, listening to the music of the workshop, the whir of the blades, the steady pulse of the dust collector, and the rustle of the wind in the oak trees outside. It was the sound of a promise kept. "He called it rotting wood, Margaret," I said, a small, peaceful smile touching my lips as I picked up a piece of raw timber. I ran my thumb over the grain, feeling the life in it. He thought it was something he could just burn down for a better view. Margaret stepped beside me, placing her hand over mine on the wood. "Let him have his view, Ava," she whispered. "He'll be looking at the sky, wondering why he's falling. We'll be down here, where the roots are, and we aren't going anywhere." I picked up my father's hand plane, the steel cool and familiar in my palm. I took the first stroke, a long, curling ribbon of oak falling to the floor like a prayer. The heritage oak wasn't just back in business, it was finally home. And as I looked at the sunlight dancing in the sawdust, I knew that the greatest masterpiece I would ever build wasn't a table or a chair. It was the life I had reclaimed, a life built on the solid, unshakable foundation of the truth. Thank you for staying with me until the end of this journey. The heritage oak is thriving again, and so am I. It taught me that sometimes the people we think are our enemies are our greatest allies, and those we love can be our biggest lessons. What would you have done in my shoes? Would you have forgiven Liam, or done exactly what I did? Please like this video and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your stories are the legacy we build together.